Hey everyone, so we're going to get started right away here. So this is Revit Family Planning. My name is Michelle Ovelson. I'm with Summit Technologies. I do a lot of the BIM implementations around Alberta and BC. And today's session we're going to go over some guide on how to organize your families, what to think about when you're creating them, and how to make sure that you're doing it efficiently and to what the deliverables are. Okay, so the first point that I really want to hammer into people is that it's not about what the object is, it's about what you need it to be for your project. So when you go to create a family, you're not just thinking about what it is in real life, you also have to think about what the requirements are for your project. What do you need it to look like in your project? What does it need to look like as a deliverable? And then that's really going to help shape what that object needs to become. So it's not about what the object is, it's about what you need it to be for the project, and that's really important. Okay, so some other things that you want to think about are your project requirements. And this is thinking about now and thinking about in the future. So it's not just about yourself. You also have to think about how are you working with consultants when creating this family? Is that a factor in the family that you're making? Is this something that they're going to have to connect to? Are you working with consultants where you're all together in one model? How are you guys working together? The next thing you want to think about are the contractors. Is this something that the contractors are going to need for the model that you're handing off to them? Or are you at that point where you are working with contractors to be able to give your model to them, and are they going to be needing this object to be a certain way, modeled in a certain way, have certain data? That's a factor as well. And the last thing you want to think about is the owners. Are they going to be receiving this model as a deliverable? And if so, then what are their requirements, if any? And you need to think about that for now, but you also need to think about in the future, is that something where your company wants to go to? So think about if that is somewhere where your company wants to be in the future, to make sure that you're creating these families in a way that makes it easy to get to that stage in the future without creating something that you'll have to redo in a few months' time if your goals and priorities change. So the next thing you want to think about is determining the number of families and the complexity of those families. There's a big balance between you want to create fewer families so that you don't have to manage as many, but you also want to make it so that they're somewhat user-friendly, even for just those power users. So there's a balance between these two. So you can end up with something that I like to call the super family. So this is when you create, let's say you created a door and you turn that door into being a single swing door, a double door, a barn door, a bifold door. You created this massive family that has all these different abilities to change itself into different things. And you have really fancy formulas, and it's something you should be very proud of that you're able to create it. But the downside can be if you go to edit that door and it breaks, you're going to spend a lot of time trying to figure out where it broke and how to fix it. Or if you're the one that created it and you know that nobody else can really edit it or touch it, if it breaks down somehow and you're not there, that's downtime for the other staff where they're trying to figure out what happened and how to fix it. And a lot of times if they can't figure that out, they're going to try cheating and doing lines for the family or some other way. So it's a balance between making it complex so that you have fewer families, but it's also making sure that it's not so complex that the amount of time you spend editing that family equals the amount of time that you would have spent editing 2 or 3 more families. So then that's the army of families. So what you don't want to do is have a family for every different option. So in the example of a door, that would be having a single door with a solid panel as one family, a single door with a vision glazing panel as one family. And now instead of having maybe 8 to 10 door families, you're getting in the range of 15 to 30. And then if you have to change something to that family, it's going to take you a very long time to go through every single family and make that update. So What you really want to find is a balance between the complexities to reduce the number of families, but also the amount of families, making sure it's not too complex to be able to edit them. So find that balance. Make sure that it is the complexity of the family versus how many families you create, and make sure it's user-friendly while not having too many families to update. Okay, so now we're going to talk a little bit about the family requirements. So whenever you're about to create a family, you need to think about the modeled requirements. So what does it need to look like? And this isn't just 3D and in real life. You're thinking about what does it need to look like in all different views, plan, section. And then the data portion. What information do you need to have in that family? And then working out whether or not you need to grab data from the family, so the output. So we're going to talk a little bit about model requirements. So first thing you want to think about is determining if it is 2D, 2.5D, or 3D. So is this object useful for clash detection? Is it something that you want to be doing clash detection on? So this is kind of narrowing down whether or not it needs to be 3D. If you want to do clash detection, or if that's something you want to be able to do in the future, you have to make that decision as to whether you want to have some sort of geometry. And this doesn't have to be really complex geometry. It could just be a box representing a clearance for an object. But do you need to have something physically there for them to use for clash detection? The next thing for 3D is renderings. Are you ever going to be rendering this object? Then that will obviously make an impact on how detailed that 3D geometry needs to be. Or will you be having some families that are their own 3D rendered families, and then you might have some simpler families that you're using all the time. So you have to kind of think about how much rendering you guys are doing in an office and how much rendering you would like to be doing. The next thing is, does it only need to be visible in plan? So this is where you're kind of debating between the 2D versus the 2.5D. So if you've gone through this and you've decided, you know, for this particular object, it's in a janitor closet, we're never doing renderings of it, it's not important for clash detection. We do need to see it in 2D and in plan, in elevation. So then now maybe you're thinking, okay, maybe we can just do it with line work in a 2D plan and a 2D in elevation. So that's where we get to the 2.5D family, where you go in and draw representations with line work in plan and in elevation. So I'll show you what that kind of looks like. So I'm just going to start with a basic one here, and we'll just draw a few things here. So let's say the other thing you have to decide when you're doing 2D is whether you want it to show up as model lines or you want to have it show up as symbolic. So this would mean maybe you're using furniture, and in 3D you don't mind being able to see the line work on the floor just to get an idea of space, but you're not using it for any rendering or clash detection. Or maybe you just don't want it to show up in 3D at all, so then you're choosing the symbolic lines. So then you're going in here and drawing out what you want it to look like in plan. And 2.5D families are a great way to be able to draw something that's kind of complex that you don't really want to go ahead and model yet, because it's just not a requirement. So you can draw your representation in plan, and then if you do need to see elevation views of it, you can go to your front view and draw that symbolic line work in the front here. This will be a very, very fancy chair. And of course you're going to go through and make sure that this is showing at the right scale and all that jazz, but for this exercise you'll get the idea. So you draw what this needs to look like in elevation. Very nice chair. And then when you're loading that into your project, you'll see that there's nothing that exists in 3D, but you do get the plan representation, and if you're showing an elevation of this, you will get the elevation representation without having to actually do any modeled extrusions or anything else like that. So this can be a really great option if it's something that's kind of complex to model and either you don't have the skill set to do that, and that's something you're going to request from, say, your BIM team later, or if it's just something that you don't need to see in 3D and you just want to show that complex geometry in elevation, plan, section, that kind of thing. So the next thing, for the more complex families, we need to look at what does it need to look like in all these different areas. So you want to think about what it needs to look like in plan, elevation, section. Are there details that it's showing up in, and 3D? So you want to take some time to sketch out what it needs to look like in these views, because again, it's not about what the object really is, but it's about what you need it to look like in the different views for your project. So from a plan perspective, this is a great example of the door. So when we look at a door family, this is a great example of overriding what it really looks like in 3D to get some kind of representation in plan. So in 3D, obviously this door isn't swung out open like this, it's actually closed, right? So this is where you're going in and turning off this panel geometry and replacing it with symbolic lines or something else to show how you want to represent this in plan versus how it really exists in 3D. So you want to think about that for plan. You also want to think about your scale of it. So is it showing up in plan on overall plan? Is that different from what you might want to see in an enlarged plan? So it's not a bad idea to sketch out not only the views that you're going to see it in, but also think about a list of drawings. So think about where it shows up on a list of drawings. So you might have it show up in plan, in enlarged plans. Maybe it shows up in plan details. And are any of those plan views different? And if so, how are they different? Because then that's going to have you start to think about different visibility options. Do we need to turn things off in coarse, medium, and fine? So there's a couple ways to control the visibility of things, right? So we can just say to not show it at all in plan. But if you need to be able to say, you know, I want to show it this way in coarse, which might be your overall plan, but I actually want to show some more detail maybe in the frame or in the panel that shows up for details, then that could be something that you have to turn off or turn on in only fine view. So it's trying to map out how the visibility is going to be controlled, whether it's by view or whether it's by detail level. And then that's also going to help plan out what different visibility requirements you need. So it could be this, it could be detail level, or it could be by subcategory, where you have a subcategory for a certain item that is set to turn off in all your view templates for certain views. So there's lots of different ways to do it, so that's why you want to start drawing out what it needs to look like in all the different views. And then you can start figuring out how you're going to be able to accomplish that. So, yeah, so there's lots of different ways to control that, so we really need to map out what that needs to be like. So the next thing that we need to focus on is the scale. So when you're drawing a family, you're kind of zoomed in, and sometimes it's easy to forget what this is actually being used for. So one of my favorite examples is the tree grate, if that's the right word for it. But basically it's those coverings that go over the trees, and I've seen these, I created a really quick one, but I've seen these modeled to the nines, where they have teeny tiny little slits all over the place to show the drainage. Now, this is a site family that is probably showing up at a scale of 1 to 100 maximum, unless you're doing some sort of detail of this tree grate, then that's different. But if you're going to show this on a set of drawings, it's probably going to start to just look like a big black blob. So you want to start thinking about, is that what you want it to look like on the sheet? Does it need to have that much detail in plan to have it show up so dark as opposed to other objects on the plan? So it's something that we kind of forgotten about when we moved over to computer. You know, it's not something that in the old days you actually had to draw those little circles, and if you weren't able to zoom in that close with your pencil to draw that, you wouldn't have done it. So start thinking about different ways to represent that. Whether you do want that level of detail, maybe that can be controlled with a hatch pattern instead of actually having to go in and model all these little circles. Probably not necessary. I've also seen this in certain washroom families, like really elaborate sinks, where they actually model the drain holes as well on the drain. So just think about what that's going to look like when you put that on your plan at a 1:100 scale. Do you really want to see just a big dark circle? Is that necessary? Was that an efficient use of your time to model it to what it really is when that's not what you need it to be for your project? So what you can do now, if you're thinking, you know what, in 3D though, I want to really get that detail. So I want to be able to actually see it for some reason, if that was what you wanted. So you did really, want to see those circles, and because you're doing a close-up shot and it just happens to be there. Then just remember that you can override this stuff in plan, right? So then you're thinking, you know what, I don't need to see this 3D geometry in plan. It's too detailed. So we can turn it off and replace it out with maybe something a little simpler, like a masking region. So then when you bring it in, you're seeing, the less detailed family at a 1:100 scale. To me, this looks a lot cleaner than showing all those tiny circles, but you can still keep your detail if you so needed to in 3D. So again, it's thinking about all the different views that it shows up in, and then figuring out how that needs to change and how you can customize it to make it work for your entire project for all the sheets. Okay, so the next thing is justify your work. So you want to make sure that you can justify the modeling strategy and that the time you spent on this family is adding value to your projects and their deliverables. Sometimes when you're in Revit, and if you're a really big family nerd like I am, it can be a lot of fun to just model the heck out of something just so that you can do it. So you go to a door family and you start modeling a really fancy doorknob that they might need on this project, and it takes a really long time. But did that actually, for the hours you spent creating something really complex and really nice, did that actually add a good value to your project? What is the reason that you're creating that? So you have to be able to justify everything that you're doing when you're creating a family to say, I'm doing it because it needs to show up in this 3D rendered view and we need it for the client. Or I'm adding this information, this data of all the information of a mechanical unit to the family because we're going to be scheduling it for the project. So whenever you're creating something as a family, you need to be thinking, I'm doing this piece because, and then have a reason for it. Because a lot of times you can just kind of get sucked in the rabbit hole of creating this family, and it can be really complex, and it can show stuff that you might not need to see, and then it ends up just getting deleted anyways. So you want to make sure that you take the time to justify what you're doing. Okay, so I'm going to go in here to this door family and talk a little bit about these modeling requirements. So for my door family, I use this as an example because it's typically one of the more complex families that we need to create across the board. So this is where we're bringing in, I talked about the visibility, so we're turning off the actual 3D geometry and replacing it with line work. And this is where this planning process comes in. So for this plan view, I had to think, okay, we need to show a door swing, but we also need to show a toggle to show it as a different kind of door swing when it's an existing door. We also need to show an option to have it be double acting with these symbolic lines. So now you have to figure out how you're going to control all those things. So for these ones, we've put in visibility parameters for double acting, so it's an on-off thing that you can toggle. But this one here, we've got existing or we've got new. So just keep in mind for a lot of these yes-no things, if you add in a formula here. So instead of having to have existing and new door side by side, and if it's new, you have to turn this on, turn this off, and if it's not, if it's existing, you turn this on, you turn that off. You can control that with a simple parameter just for not. So if it's a one or the other, then you're just going to put not in front of the other so that by default it's going to be new. And then if somebody goes in and selects this door and says it is existing, then it turns off the new and it shows it as existing. So that can be a really nice way to set things up so that you don't have to be toggling for two things where it's either or. It's a good way to set it up so that you don't have to be turning both on and off all the time. So the other thing is the nesting in of detail stuff. So for this particular door, it depends on how fancy your company wants to get with the swing. So some clients like to be able to show an angle to their door swing. This is mostly a residential thing. And that gets to be really difficult and complicated to just use line work to have it control all of that. So when you have a certain set of objects or lines within a family that it's getting really hard to control all of them, but they're kind of grouped together, this is why you would nest something in. So we nested the door swing in that already has the swing capability so that you can control that and not have it mess up the family. It's just a simpler way to work. So just keep in mind whenever you are nesting in objects into other families, if you have parameters within there, so within this door family, let's just pop in here quick. We have a width parameter, so of course that's changing the size of the door for the graphics. And then we also have this angle in here, the 90-degree angle. So you need to make sure that you tie these parameters or associate these parameters from the nested family to your actual family. So that's where this little square comes in. That's the associate family parameter. So then you're tying the width of this family, the door swing, to your single door family. So that now if I change the width in the family here, it's changing the width in the nest. Okay? So you want to do that with anything that you make as parameters in your nested family. Make sure you're tying those all back to your host family so that everything is working as expected. Okay, so now talking a little bit about the setup of this. We have graphic parameters in here, and this will tie a little bit into the data section that I'm going to talk about later, but this is where you're grabbing actual 3D geometry. And if they need to have, let's say you want the ability to be able to change its color graphically. You want to be able to pick, you know, a panel color, different change of the glass. Again, make sure that because this is nested in, that you've associated these parameters to the host one. And then you can change that to that parameter graphically. Now, the other thing I wanted to talk about, which is nice with nested families, is that you can add a parameter to the family itself. So this is really handy if you want to be able to switch out one panel for another, so one family for another. So we want to add a label to it. So this is the same way you add a label to dimensions, materials, anything like that. So you add a label, you call that the panel type. And then because I've nested in here a bunch of different panels, now what that allows you to do is switch that out as a parameter. So this is where you start getting into, you know, you're taking that family up to the next level. So instead of having 4 different families for representing the different types of panels, I have nested the panels into this family, making it one family instead of 4 or 5. So then you have the ability to just switch this out to a different panel, and it adjusts and switches out the family for you. This is a great way to reduce the number of families for your overall warehouse without having it being too complex. So just make sure that they're all the same object category, make sure they have the same origin points, and then you'll be able to swap one out for another and have that be a parameter that you can control in your project, which is a really nice way to do things. So you just want to, again, make sure that you select that panel, make sure you add, up here, add a parameter, then you would type in panel type, decide whether it needs to be type or instance, and then where you want to group it under. Okay. All right, so let's go back into here. So dimension parameters. If it doesn't need to change size, don't make it a parameter. So again, when you're first starting out building your family, you want to ask yourself, does this frame ever change size for the representation that you're showing? If it does, then yes, it needs to be parametered. But if it doesn't, you can simply just lock it down with the size. Same thing for your door thickness. Does that need to be changing? Is that something that you schedule? And if it is something you schedule, it needs to be a parameter, but if not, it doesn't. So just make sure that, when you're first creating your family, you don't need to go crazy and make sure that everything is able to flex and change. You really want to flesh out how this family needs to work. And that can help for, those junior people working on projects so they don't accidentally change a number that they thought they could change. If it's something that's an office standard or an industry standard, make sure that you're kind of setting that to a set size so it doesn't get accidentally switched to something else. Okay, so next thing we're going to talk about is the data requirements. So what needs to be scheduled for this object? What are you tagging? And the big thing for this is it pre-populated in the family? Okay, so this comes into whether or not you need shared parameters. Now, I am a big fan of using shared parameters as little as possible because I found that they can be really hard to manage unless you have very good communication amongst your office. Sometimes people don't know where the shared parameters are. If you load a family into a project that wasn't started with the right template, you won't be able to use those shared parameters. I get a lot of just confusion within offices amongst shared parameters, so you really want to make sure that you're very organized with when you are using them. It's very clear that they are shared parameters, and making sure that everything's been set up properly with your template file and with the families. So now, it only needs to be a shared parameter if it is pre-populated in the family. So that means that a lot of parameters that need to show up in your door schedule, those don't need to be in this family as a shared parameter. They can all be hosted in the project file as project parameters. So then when you go in and add your, let's call this door hardware. So you'd add all of these into your template file so that they're ready. Now the really nice thing about adding this into your template file versus adding it into your doors is if somebody A, creates their own door, or B, grabs a door from online, and this isn't just for doors, this is for any object. So if it's created as a shared parameter and they didn't know, they'll add doors or objects from online, from somewhere else that hasn't been populated with those shared parameters, and then you won't be able to fill out the shared parameters very easily. So this is a lot easier to just be able to have them all hosted in the project, and then the parameters, when they load the door in, the parameters will just be available to them. So you add this in, group that under data. Then when you load these families in, they have everything you need to fill out your door schedule. It's not something that really needs to be hosted in your door families. The only reason that you might need it is, let's say, is when a parameter basically ties to the object or to the dimensions of the family. So if you wanted to schedule for a double door, you had, door size A and door size B, that's not an out-of-the-box parameter. So that's something that you would have to create as a shared parameter and then create that parameter as well into your project, because then you can be able to schedule it. So that's where it is related to geometry. versus just being data. And data, for the most part, unless it is preset, it doesn't need to be in here. Except for the let me go to a 3D view here. So let's say the door elevation. So that's a typical thing that people use in schedules. So they put like a code or a number or a letter for representing the different panels. So let's say that a double glazing panel is always a B. That's just the number that it goes into. So that's where you would want to create that as a shared parameter, because so you would go in, create this as a shared parameter, pick it, type or instance. Again, now because this panel type is a type, you would want the same thing to be for your door elevation because it's directly tied to the panel type. So I'm not going to do the shared for here because I'd have to set up a file, but it'll show you the same thing. So then you would go in here and say B, and then when it's double glazed, it's B. If you have a different panel, it's solid. That door elevation wants to be A. So this is where it needs to be a shared parameter, because then Revit needs to be able to pull that parameter information from the family into the project. So you'd need to add this shared parameter to the family and also to your project template file. And because it is pre-populated, it will bring this information into your project because it's already been locked down. So otherwise, I keep my my family's very lean with information. The out-of-the-box stuff you want to have, but a lot of stuff that is just related to data, it's not necessary to have in the family. It just adds an extra step that you don't need. I want to talk a little bit about the graphics section and the materials. So the reason I have this as graphics versus it being data is because this is relating to the material that's going to show up as a rendering, as opposed to, let's say, the panel material that you would schedule and be calling that, you know, wood or metal or whatever it is. So that's different from, you know, me grabbing a material that's a red color, metallic color. So then I'm not scheduling my actual material, I'm just scheduling a data parameter that I want to be able to fill out with whatever code I want. So that's why they're separate. So when you have this in your project, oh, sorry. You have your door that has graphics, but then you also have stuff that would be under data or the construction of it that would be different from what you're using as a rendered material. Now, you don't have to do it this way. It just depends. I've found in the past it just gives you a little more flexibility to have materials be whatever name you want them to be and not have to follow what you want them to show up in your door schedule. So you also have to, so that's what you need to think about when you're looking at the data required for the object. So what does the schedule need to look like? Is it being scheduled, and then what data do you need to get out of it? Then the next thing you need to ask yourself is that data that's related to the family geometry or size? Then it needs to be shared because it's going to be pre-populated in the family. If it's just data that you're assigning once it's in the project, that can be project parameters. If it needs to be tagged, then that's something you need to add to the tag family and the project template. You can add it to the family, that's optional, but it will still work if it hasn't been added to the family. It just needs to be the project and the tag, and you will be able to tag it. But most often for Revit things, you're able to tag the out-of-the-box stuff, so that's either the mark or the type mark. And again, it's always best to use out-of-the-box parameters versus creating your own. It's only when something doesn't work for you that you want to be able to use a duplication. So an example of that would be the fire rating. So you may have seen in here that I have this little lockdown saying in here. Now, this is for clients that want the door fire rating to be instance-based and not type-based. And that can happen. So you first have to make the decision that, you know what, if where an out of the box parameter doesn't work for you and you need to make a duplicate one, you should always be typing something in under the formula. And if you use quotations here, what that'll do is it'll lock down this field so that if somebody is, you know, maybe this is a contractor that's looking at this model and they don't know, they would expect to find fire rating as an out of the box one, but at least filling, at least filling this out allows them to know where to go. So you should always fill out a little text information here to say use the instance fire rating parameter that's been set up instead. So point them in the right direction if you're not going to use an out of the box one. But try to use out of the box as much as you can, just for the fact that that's kind of a universal thing. So if somebody goes to look for a description of something, they're going to look at the out of the box one instead of looking for a parameter that you've called door description that basically does the same thing. Okay. Okay, so talked about that. I wanted to talk a bit about parameter organization. So this goes to all of the headings that you get when you're creating your family. It's really important to make sure that the data that is for the user is at the front, is at the top, versus stuff that's not as important can kind of go near the bottom. And that's one reason why I've always liked to put things that are controlled with formulas in the other category. Now, even though there is a group called constraints, which kind of makes sense to put there, that puts it way up at the top. And I don't like people and users being able to see all of my parameters that are kind of working in the background with formulas. I don't like to see those up at the very front because that's not important to them. They don't need to know when they're going to fill stuff out or edit this door in the family. They really don't need to know that information up at the very top. So that is usually why it goes into other, where it's at the very bottom. The other thing that you might want to avoid is things like visibility is also one that I've seen. So if you're controlling something, like a visibility of the object, you could put it under visibility, but that's going to put it at the very bottom of the list pretty much. And for somebody that's new to editing this door, they might not know that that's even an option because they can't see it when they first open the type, and if they forget to scroll down, it could just be a little more confusing. So put things under the right categories, but what's going to trump that is how easily available it is to see. So my rule of thumb is to put things that are important to the user up at the top. So that's where I've put a lot of things under construction. So whether or not it's double acting, the panel type, the swing angle, all that kind of stuff goes up near the top. Then your dimensions are all together. Any kind of dimensions that are being controlled with formulas, those would go under the other section. So this would be moved back to the other, along with anything else that's being controlled and you don't really have access to. Existing, that again could go under phasing, but it could go with construction with the rest of the door. And then your materiality. So if you do decide to do something like this where your materials are separate from the data parameter that are materials, make sure you put them under something that makes sense for them so that they don't get mishmashed in with all of the other data parameters for your door schedule. So that's why I put them under graphics, so that the user knows that it's for graphic use only. It's not reflective of the data. So that's, the organization can be really important to the end user to make sure that they know where to find things. So the same can be said when you're starting to add data to your project for the door schedule and such. You want to come up with a plan for where you want all that data to be. So the only thing that makes this stuff kind of difficult is when Revit puts in out-of-the-box parameters that could also be used for your door schedule, things like frame material and finish. You guys have to make a decision whether you want to use those or whether you want to just tell your staff, you know, everything that we're scheduling is going to be under door data. But I would really try to use the out-of-the-box ones. And then, you know, just point your staff in the direction, and that kind of comes with standards. What I like to do is have a snapshot of the instance parameters and of the type parameters, and then say, and then when the user goes to create, you know, a door schedule or they're new to your office, you just highlight out what things are for. So, you know, if you're using the frame type for the door schedule, then, you know, highlight that, say, for door schedule. Highlight this for door schedule, so that they have a guide to know which parameters you're using, and if you're not using ones that they might expect to use, they know where to go. So there's nothing worse than if you did decide to have duplications for things like frame material and put them all under data. If the user doesn't know where to fill out the door schedule information, they might be filling it out up here and then not know that you had a duplication down here, and now you've got a double workflow kind of thing, and a bigger chance for error. So that's something else that you really want to watch out for. Okay, so that was most of what I wanted to discuss today. So the big thing that I want people to come out of with this is, again, that it's not about what the object is, it's about what you need it to be for your project. So the planning aspect, especially for things that are kind of complex, and especially for things that are a staple to your project. So for architecture, you know, things like doors, windows, casework, things that you are using all the time that have that need to be tagged, that need to, you know, get schedules made for them. You need to plan that out. You need to think about what they need to look like, what views they show up in, and make sure that they've been set up in a way that works for your deliverables. So think about what you need to, what the end result needs to be, and then make sure that you kind of have that in mind as you're planning out your families, because it is very important to make sure that they work for your project and that they've been done efficiently. The next thing is that I would really want to point out is the justifying your work. So make sure that, you know, you don't go down the rabbit hole of modeling something just because it's really cool and fun, and, you know, you're learning how to create all these custom formulas, and yeah, you can kind of get sucked in, and you can spend a lot of time doing something that doesn't add an equivalent value to your project at the end of the day. So that's part of that planning process. Figure out what it needs to be, and then create the family according to that spec, because if you just start going and creating the family and figuring it out as you go, there's a lot of things that you might miss. You load it in and you didn't realize that it shows up a certain way in your building section, and you didn't want it to see, you didn't want to see it that way, and yeah, so it's just trying to find those areas before you create your family, and then it'll work a lot better for you in the end. All right, so does anyone have any questions? I see some hands raised. Attendees dashboard. Hold on here. Questions. Jeremy, do you think you could point me in the direction of where I find the hand raised? Oh. Hand raised. Sorry, can you, if you have questions, just write them in the chat section, and then I can see what your question is. And I don't see anything yet. So yeah, if you have questions, please feel free to type them out now. Okay, I see a couple in here. Okay, so do larger family file size impact the model performance? Yes, so the larger the family, the larger your projects are going to be in general. So that can also be a consideration. Luckily, when you are working with families, let's say you have a 500 kilobyte family and you load that into your project and that goes around your project 100 times, Revit only records that 500 kilobytes once. So again, that's the big reason why we use families versus using things like model groups and line work, because it's more efficient when you're using a lot of them. But yeah, it's a consideration for sure. Your larger family file, it will eventually. So that's why if it's justified, you needed it to be that big because you needed to add that much model geometry to it because it's necessary to your project, then that's just something that you have to deal with and try to balance out elsewhere. But that's a big reason why we don't want to over model things that we don't need to be modeling that to that extent. That's another reason why if you guys are doing a lot of renderings, what you can do is put those rendered families on a separate work set that can be turned off, or you can always link your project into another file and then add in those, you know, heavy rendered families and do it that way. So there's a few different ways you can set it up. Would I be willing to share my door family? That is typically something that we develop for clients. So that's kind of part of my implementation work where we sit down with a client and work out what the requirements are and then go from there. So you can email us if that's something that you would be interested in. We'd be happy to work with you guys to set up your doors or your library or whatever you might need. Is this webinar going to be available after? Yes. So we are recording this webinar and then it will go up on our YouTube page. So if you go to YouTube Summit AEC, you can find this webinar and any other webinars we've done in the past. Okay, general. Love the edit tooltip in the parameter properties, and the parameters can be moved up or down. Oh, yes. So just a general comment saying that I love the edit tooltip in the parameter properties, and that parameters can be moved up or down in the list for better editing. So in case anyone's wondering what she's talking about, there is the ability, and I can't remember what release this changed in, but it's really nice, something I forgot to mention, the ability to change and move up and down your parameters. So this can be a really nice thing for organization. So again, putting the most important dimensional parameters at the top and then making your way down with dimensions that maybe are changed less often than others. But again, putting all the information that's most important up at the top can be really helpful. So being able to move those up and down is really nice. Will import CAD or 3D entity to family help or hinder model performance? Well, or 3D entities. So I always use CAD or other 3D entities as a starting point, and then I will use Revit geometry. The reason for that will be a couple different things. So for example, you have more control with your subcategories for Revit versus bringing in line work and CAD stuff. And you have the ability to add, you know, materiality to extrusions in Revit versus if you just bring in a 3D entity, you don't really have control over picking specific parts of them and being able to turn them on or off in certain views. So in general, I prefer to have real Revit geometry, unless there's some instance where it would just be really difficult to do so. But I would say 98% of the time, that's what I'm doing. Next question. Okay, so symbolic lines can also be used for showing clearances of your equipment, or is there a better way to do it? I was thinking that it would keep 3D a lot cleaner. Yes, so this just depends on what you need for clearances. So again, if you don't need to see it in 3D, and the big thing is clash detection here. So if you need to do clash detection, you need to have some sort of 3D geometry there so that it can clash into something else. But if you're just using a family to show let's say clearances. So I'm going to use this tree grate as an example. So if this was some sort of mechanical equipment, what you can do, and you have a few different options here, you can place in invisible lines. I found works quite nicely for your clearances, because then you can create a box that only shows up. This is where it depends on where you want to see it. So if you want to just be able to load it into your project and you'll only see it when you hover over, then you can see your clearances. This is sometimes a nice way to do it. We'll do this for furniture or for something else if you need to see how far you need to go. But if you actually need to be able to print these lines or be able to see them in the view without having them selected, then you want to come up with either using hidden lines, or if you want to be able to toggle this on and off, you could create a subcategory called clearance, and then in your view templates you can choose whether or not you want to turn those on or off. Some thank yous. Thank you very much. Let's see here. We've got another one. Do you build all your own families, or do you download some? If so, where do you download from? Honestly, it's been a really long time since I have downloaded families from online, but it's still necessary for some clients. I know that Bradley, as an example, has a lot of content for Revit that a lot of people want to get their washroom accessories from if they really need that level of detail. But honestly, for most of the big things that I'm using 90% of the time, I'm going through and customizing myself, just for the fact that you do need to think about your deliverable. And usually stuff online, it can be a good starting point, but you always have to go through and clean stuff out. I find they tend to over-model things just because it depends on who their audience is, right? They're trying to cater for kind of everybody, so they can be a little more detailed than you might need for your projects. So you just want to go through and make sure that you clean out that extra geometry that you don't need, go through the parameters and clean out ones that, again, you're not needing or using for any kind of data output, and then just renaming it according to your office standard. Next question. For a staggered stacked brick wall, is it possible to create a parameter that picks every second panel in the curtain wall and turn it off? Interesting question. This is something I might have to email you about later because it's a little more complex than something I can answer right now. Yeah, that would be something you might have to contact us afterwards, and we can kind of go through different options because there's probably a few different ways to do that. And can you further explain the difference between model lines and symbolic lines in families? Okay, so the big difference is 2D versus 3D. So let's go back to that little weird couch family I made. If these are created as model lines, you see loudly I just converted those across. I'll do the same for these ones. I'm going to mute here. Convert that. There we go. Okay, so converting these. Okay, so now when you load this into the project, I'll show you what it looks like, and it's going to look really weird. So in plan and in elevation, it's still going to look fine because it's still showing you those representations. It's in 3D where it's going to start to look different and weird. So this is because I made these as model lines, you see them in 3D. And for a 2.5D family, you're probably not going to need to see this kind of representation in 3D. So what you could do as a compromise, I've seen people in the past draw in plan, have those be model lines so that, if they do a 3D shot of their interior, they can kind of see the furniture layout in 3D without having the actual geometry there. But you don't need to see your elevation in 3D or your side view in 3D. So those would be symbolic because they only show up as 2D in the view that they are in. So symbolic is basically the equivalent to detail lines in the project, and model lines are 3D. I find with clearances within the family, you can accidentally drag the family if you click within the clearance. If the family isn't pinned, is there a way around this without pinning? That's a good question. I can't think of one off the top of my head, because unless you had them turned off potentially. So if I try, let me try something else here. So does it make a difference if your subcategory is turned off? Yeah, so that would be the solution there. So if you don't want to accidentally be selecting your clearances, your best bet there is making those lines a subcategory. So I would have one in here, not called pads, but that's called clearance. And then you can control that with your view templates and have them turned off by default. And then only when you want to see them in those views, then you'll turn them on. So that means that in the views that they're turned off in, you're not going to accidentally grab them or move them. And then in the views that you do want them in, you'll be able to see them. So that would be my answer to that one. All right. So if there are no other questions, I'm gonna end the webinar. So thank you all very much for attending. And if you do have any questions later on, please feel free to get a hold of us. And just wanted to make note of our blog. So after this post, we are going to put it onto our YouTube channel, but it'll also be on our blog. So that's the summitac.com BIM blog. You can find us on Twitter at SummitAC, and you can always check out our websites. We have our whole list of team on there, so you can take a look at what we do and our different members. And if you have any questions, again, please feel free to email us, and we'll try to get back to you. Okay, thanks a lot, guys.